Even though it's been 7 years since its release, Nvidia's GTX 10 series has aged remarkably well. Up until now, I've primarily discussed the GTX 1060 on the channel, a commendable budget card in its own right. Today, I'm eager to share my experiences with the next tier up in the Pascal cards hierarchy, the GTX 1070. This GPU has piqued my interest, especially with prices taking a nosedive in the last 6 months or so. In this video, my aim is to investigate whether the GTX 1070 remains a viable budget option for gamers, even in the year of 2023. Before delving into the 1070, I wanted to reiterate the core focus of my channel. Despite having addressed this concern before, it seems that some viewers may not fully grasp the primary purpose, despite the channel name making it fairly apparent. My overarching focus revolves around components and systems that fit into a low or very low budget bracket. The challenge of optimizing cost to performance at the lowest possible cost is what intrigues me the most. It's far more engaging than testing high-end components. With low-end or older budget parts, there are trade-offs and expectations that must be reasonable. Moving forward, I won't entertain or respond to comments that blatantly question the overall approach towards the super budget segment that I share. However, I'm open to recommendations for alternative budget components to review in the future. Now, let's delve into the background of the GTX 1070. Launched in 2016, it's an upper mid-range addition to the Pascal series. While it retailed for $379 at launch, you can snag one on the used market for around $100 or less currently. Built with a 16nm process, it features a PCIe 3.0x16 bus interface, and even boasts a DirectX 12 12.1 feature level. Despite being a 7-year-old card, the onboard specs still hold up well. With a base clock of 1506 MHz, boost clock of 1683 MHz, and a 2002 MHz memory clock. Notably, it comes with a substantial 8GB of GDDR5 video memory running on a 256-bit bus width. The 1070 has 1920 shading units, 120 TMUs, and 64 ROPs. With a 150-watt TDP, the card requires decent cooling and is best paired with at least a 450 or 500-watt power supply at a minimum. My 1070 is an EVGA FTW ACX 3.0 version with a 7% factory overclock, featuring a robust heatsink and a dual fan design, along with a premium, mostly aluminum shroud and LED branding on the front. It looks quite sharp. For video output, there are 3 DisplayPort 1.4 ports, 1 HDMI 2.0, and 1 DVI out. I managed to pick this particular card up locally for $80 on Facebook Marketplace. On paper, the 1070 still performs admirably and continues to receive updated driver support. It should be capable of running most any title in 1080p with 60 FPS at appropriate settings. Despite conducting thorough research, I wanted to put the 1070 through its paces in a few titles to witness its capabilities firsthand. My test bench features the 6-core, 12-threaded Ryzen 5 5600X with 32GB of DDR4 RAM clocked at 3600 MHz. Running Windows 10 and games off a Gen 3 NVMe SSD, this setup will push the GTX 1070 to its limits, making it entirely GPU-bound. All games will run at 1080p, as I believe this is the most fitting resolution for this card, although it could likely handle 1440p in some games. Additionally, game recording will be done using an Elgato HD 60S capture card to alleviate extra encoding stress, although the 1070's NVENC encoder could handle some light streaming if that's of interest. The graphic settings will mostly be presets in order to keep things simple and repeatable. Also, the 1070 is still a card with a decent amount of power. I'm going for a higher refresh rate experience in easier to run titles and around 60 FPS or more in more intensive games. To kick things off, I fired up Counter-Strike 2, pushing it to its limits at 1080p with the very high preset. Opting for a bot match on the iconic Dust 2 map, the results were nothing short of impressive, boasting an average of 164 frames per second and a 1% low of 95 frames. The fluid gameplay experience was a testament to the GTX 1070's prowess. Next, I transitioned to Fortnite with the OG update. I dove into the game's visuals at 1080p and DX11. Opting for the epic quality preset, I wanted to see how far I could push the graphics. The 1070 held its ground admirably, delivering an average of approximately 78 FPS and a 1% low of 26 FPS. For competitive players out there, dialing down the settings would undoubtedly make the GTX 1070 a powerhouse in this game. Shifting gears to GTA 5, I cranked up the settings to the max at 1080p. Despite the game's age, it can still stress budget hardware. However, the GTX 1070 shrugged off the challenge, producing a robust 104 FPS and a 1% low of 75 FPS. Venturing into the Wild West with Red Dead Redemption 2, I opted for a balanced approach with medium graphics settings. While encountering a few minor stutters and occasional screen tearing, the GTX 1070 maintained a playable experience averaging 60 FPS with a 1% low of 34 FPS. The visuals of ancient Egypt came next in Assassin's Creed Origins, with the GTX 1070 tackling the high preset at 1080p. Despite the game's demanding nature for lower-end hardware, the graphics card showcased stability, boasting an average of 84 FPS and a solid 1% low of 72 FPS. Horizon Zero Dawn followed suit, with the GTX 1070 flexing its muscles at a medium or balanced preset. Surpassing the 60 FPS mark comfortably, it achieved an average of 98 FPS and a 1% low of 73 at these settings, hinting at its capability to handle higher settings with ease. Cyberpunk 2077 was up next, challenging the 1070 at high settings. The built-in benchmarking tool revealed a commendable performance, yielding a solid 61 FPS average and a 1% low of 47 FPS. In Forza Horizon 5, I anticipated a good showing at the high preset in the built-in benchmark. The results exceeded expectations, showcasing a remarkable 131 FPS and a 1% low of 105 FPS. Next, on to some 2023 releases. Hogwarts Legacy took the stage at high settings with FSR 2 set to balanced. Navigating Hogsmeade Village, the 1070 maintained a respectable average of around 66 FPS with a 1% low of 37 FPS. Meanwhile, in the less demanding areas in and around the castle, framerate soared well beyond 75 FPS in most cases. Wrapping up the performance gauntlet, Starfield came next with realistic expectations. Acknowledging the potential struggle, I set the GTX 1070 to low settings with FSR 2.0 enabled. In the challenging New Atlantis area, the visuals were a bit rough, and stability took a hit, resulting in a 57 FPS average and an 8 FPS 1% low. Considering the taxing nature of this specific environment, the game remained notably playable for most users. Really, if this was the worst the 1070 will do in this particular game, other areas will likely run much better. After putting the GTX 1070 through its paces, I was genuinely impressed with how well it still performs. At 1080p gaming, it consistently gets the job done, especially if you're open to tweaking settings for optimal performance. This card is a solid recommendation for anyone with realistic expectations who isn't fixated on features like DLSS or ray tracing. And the best part, it's a fantastic value at around $100 US. However, it's essential to note that the 1070 and other 10 series cards might have slightly less future driver support compared to newer GPUs. Considering alternatives in a similar price range, newer options like the 1660 Super NTI, GTX 2060, and RX 5600 XT may be worth exploring. Looking ahead, I've got exciting content lined up before the year concludes, including a wallet-friendly $70 super budget build for older games and emulation, and the next PC flip featuring a Ryzen 5 1600X CPU. If that's the kind of content you enjoy, don't forget to hit subscribe, and as always, drop your feedback, questions, or suggestions in the comments. Thanks for your support.